You're watching the legal breakdown. So Glenn, we've got a pretty stunning development. Here, Donald Trump is now suing the judge in his Manhattan criminal trial, as part of a last-ditch effort to avoid that trial, which of course, is set to begin next week on April 15th. First of all, what is the likelihood that this stunt will actually work? Brian, ordinarily, I would say 0.0%. I think you could probably serve 100 criminal prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys, and ask them, have you ever had a case where, virtually on the eve of trial, the defendant sued the judge to try to put a stop to the case, beginning? And the answer is almost certainly no, 100 times no. My lingering concern though is, remember, we had a New York Appeals Court act not too long ago, when Donald Trump had a money judgment entered against him for $464 million, and the appeals court swooped in after Donald Trump said, I can't put up a bond for that amount, and I won't put up a bond for that amount, and for some reason that went entirely unexplained, the New York Appeals Court cut it to $175 million, and Donald Trump has apparently put up a bond. But stay tuned, because the bond is being challenged. Ordinarily, I would say 0.0% chance, but because of that history, that the New York Appeals Court now has of doing Donald Trump an enormous favor with no explanation and no analysis, I will be concerned until we see those jurors file into that New York courtroom, beginning on April 15th for jury selection. And I am not going to count my trial chickens before Donald Trump is actually seated at counsel table. But in theory, they would have to take up this issue pretty quickly, one way or the other, to resolve it before the jury is said to be seated just next week. So we can expect to see a resolution, one way or the other, in the next week or so, correct? We can. So the process in New York is basically, this will be handled as an emergency motion, and just one New York State Appellate Court judge will rule on it now, and we've seen this happen before, and that one judge will very likely deny, and then Donald Trump can try to raise it with the 5-judge panel and have all of them decide, whether they should delay Donald Trump's trial or not. I am pretty darn confident that the judges will reject this out of hand, because I really do see it as more than just a manipulation of the court system. I see it as an abuse. Criminal defendants don't get to sue the judge on the eve of trial to put a stop to their trial commencing, so I'm relatively confident that we're going to get an answer. We're going to get an answer soon, and that answer will be no, Donald, you're going to trial beginning on April 15th. Well, in a further display of his desperation, he filed a separate filing with an appeals court, asking the court to move the trial outside of Manhattan. What are the chances that that last effort is actually going to be successful? That one, I'm going with 0.0, because first of all, ordinarily, if there is pre-trial publicity that saturates a particular community, when the crime is of local notoriety, then maybe you have a motion to change the venue, to move the trial to another location, where that the case hasn't gotten the kind of media attention that it got in the jurisdiction where it is to be tried. But here's the thing, Donald Trump can complain about the jury pool in Manhattan being, heavily voting Democrat rather than Republican. That is absolutely not a basis to successfully challenge the venue and have the case moved to another jurisdiction. That motion, I think, is dead in the water. Of course, Donald Trump is also trying to appeal the gag order that was recently expanded by Judge Marchand to say, what? You also can't post about, thereby endanger family members of prosecutors, court staff, the judge's family. Donald Trump can appeal that until the cows come home, and in the event the appellate court wants to take that up, fine. There's no reason to, but fine, because that does not stop the trial from progressing. Now, last week you and I had spoken about Trump making the issue of presidential immunity, putting that forward to try and stop this case from going to trial. Is the fact that Trump is now suing Judge Marchand kind of a tacit admission that that attempt is dead in the water? That's a great question. I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen Donald Trump appeal Judge Marchand's denial of the presidential immunity motion. In essence, Donald Trump said, let's just put my trial on hold until the Supreme Court gets around to ruling whether a president is absolutely immune against prosecution. Judge Marchand pretty easily denied that, in part because it was filed about 10 months late, and it was filed for tactical advantage. There was no excuse for Donald Trump to have waited 17 days before his trial was to start, and Judge Marchand told him so. and we haven't seen an appeal of that rule. I don't think an appeal would be successful in shutting down Donald Trump's trial. But since when has the prospect of success been a prerequisite for Donald Trump and his lawyers filing anything? Alright, well, top line here for the viewers. What % certainty do you have that 1 week from now, jury selection will begin in Manhattan? My go-to Brian is that I am not a gambling man. I'm not a high roller. $1 is my betting limit. I'm going to put 95 cents of my $1. I'm going to hedge my bet by 5 cents, that we will see jury selection commence on April 15th, because there really is no issue of substance that I think the appeals court will grab onto and say, you know what, Donald Trump has been trying to delay his trial ever since he was indicted. We see through all of these tactics for what they are: gamesmanship, trying to put off his ultimate day of reckoning in the New York state courts, and we're not going to play on Donald Trump's playing field. So I think we're going to see jury selection start on April 15th. Glenn, when the court sees that Donald Trump is putting forward motion after motion, with the obvious intent to be to delay this trial, is that actually hurt the subsequent motions that he's putting forward? Because it becomes apparent that they're not really being done in good faith, that they're just part of this throw spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks barrage of kind of dilatory tactics that Trump is putting forward. Common sense would say, yes, but in my experience, Brian, most judges will take each motion as it comes, and they will assess it on its merits, even if it is what we call a vexatious litigant. There's a big word, somebody who inundates the court with frivolous motion, after frivolous motion after frivolous motion. Actually, when it gets so bad, judges can bar vexatious litigants from filing any more motions, but that is rare. I think judges, even though they know what Donald Trump is up to, and they're not inclined to play his games, they will assess every motion on its four corners, without looking at the history of frivolous motions that Trump and his lawyers have filed. They will resolve it, and then they'll move on to the next motion that Trump files. So the next question then becomes, could Trump be a convicted felon in time for the November election? Could you speak on the timeline here, as far as this trial is concerned from beginning to end? Yeah, the parties are projecting, the prosecutor is suggesting, jury selection could take a week or two. I think what we call the government's case in chief which is when the prosecutors present all of their evidence, will probably take 2 to 3 weeks. Then it shifts to the defense. The defense can put on a case if they choose to, or they can put on no case at all, because the burden always rests with the government, with the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that burden never shifts to the defense, and the defense doesn't have to present any evidence at all. But it looks like this case could probably go to the jury for purposes of them beginning their deliberations by sometime in May. Maybe late May. We could see Donald Trump being a convicted felon now. Technically, let me just tell everybody that you're not actually a convicted felon until after you've been sentenced. But for all practical purposes, if a jury votes guilty, they find you guilty of felony charges, you are in substance a convicted felon. You've been convicted by a jury of your peers. I think we could see Donald being a convicted felon by on or around June 1st. Alright, well, here's a question that we get a lot. Would a conviction then do anything to prevent Trump from running for office, or from taking office? It's not a legal impediment to somebody running for office, including the presidency or holding office. He could be governing from, inside a jail cell. But practically speaking, politically speaking, I don't really pay attention to the polls, and goodness knows, I'm not a political analyst, but I have even seen, Trump supporters say, well, if he is a convicted felon, come November, even I probably wouldn't vote for him. So I think the political implications are far more drastic than the legal implications. Okay, and finally, let's talk about the spectrum of what the sentencing could look like in this trial. Like if he's found guilty of all the charges that he's being accused of right now, what could we be looking at? He's charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Under the laws of New York, it's a Class E felony, and if you're convicted, you can be sentenced to up to 4